Viktor Volkov slammed the intelligence report onto the table and laughed. Not a polite laugh, a soldier's laugh, cold dismissive, carved from years of watching enemies underestimate him first. They sent a woman to cover the whole team. He looked at his second in command. The Americans are getting desperate. That laugh would cost him everything. And if you've ever been the person everyone counted out before the moment that mattered most, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The briefing room smelled like coffee that had been sitting too long and men who hadn't slept enough. That was the first thing Megan Carter noticed when she walked through the door. The second thing she noticed was the silence. Not the polite kind of silence. Not the kind that falls over a room when someone important enters. This was the other kind, the kind that carries weight, that lands on your shoulders the moment you step across a threshold and realize that every pair of eyes in the room has already made a decision about you before you opened your mouth. She had felt that silence before. In the academy, in advanced training, in every room where she was the youngest, the quietest, the one who didn't fit the shape that everyone else had already agreed upon. But this room was different. This room had men who had bled together. Men who had carried each other out of places that didn't exist on any official map. Men who had lost friends and kept going anyway because stopping wasn't something their bodies knew how to do. Task Force Iron Wolf. The name alone carried a reputation that most special operations units spent entire careers trying to build. They weren't famous in the way that celebrities were famous. They were famous in the way that a storm is famous quietly among the people who had survived one. Megan walked to her assigned position at the briefing table and sat down. She didn't look around. She didn't try to establish herself. She put her folder on the table, folded her hands on top of it, and waited. That restraint cost her something, because in that room at that moment, the men who were watching her interpreted her stillness as uncertainty. They read her quiet as someone holding herself together through sheer determination, someone who was pretending to belong in a place where she hadn't earned her seat. They were wrong about almost everything, but they didn't know that yet. Master Chief Daniel Sullivan was the first one to actually look at her. Not glance, not assess from the corner of his eye, but look. Sullivan had the kind of face that a certain kind of hard life builds over time. Not ugly, not old exactly, but worn in the specific places that war wears a man. Around the eyes, along the jaw, in the set of his mouth, which rarely moved toward anything resembling ease. He had survived 3 combat deployments with Iron Wolf. He had pulled 2 operators out of a burning vehicle outside Mosul. He had once gone 41 hours without sleep during an operation that the official records still classified as something other than what it actually was. He had seen a lot of people walk into briefing rooms. He had learned over many years and many mistakes that the ones who tried hardest to look confident in the first 30 seconds were often the ones who fell apart in the first 30 seconds of contact. The ones who sat quietly and waited, those were the ones worth watching. But even Sullivan, with all of that experience behind him, looked at Megan Carter and felt the pull of doubt. Not about her skill set. Her file was exceptional. Her marksmanship scores put her in a category that even the most experienced instructors mark with a small private kind of respect. His doubt was something else. It was the question that nobody in that room was willing to ask out loud, but that every single person was thinking. Could she hold herself together when it actually mattered? Because a rifle range was not a battlefield. Scores on paper were not decisions made under fire. And the role she had been assigned, Overwatch Sniper for the primary assault element, was not a role that allowed for hesitation. One miscalculation and the team was exposed. One delayed shot and someone's family would be getting a visit from a uniformed officer with a folded flag. Sullivan studied her from across the table and made himself reserve judgment. That was the professional thing to do. That was what his experience had taught him. But the men sitting beside him were not thinking professionally. Ryan Hayes leaned toward the operator on his left, a compact, serious man named Torres, who had joined Iron Wolf 18 months ago and had already established himself as someone worth listening to and spoke quietly enough that the sound didn't carry to the front of the room. "She has never been in the field with us," Hayes said. It wasn't accusation. It wasn't cruelty. It was the kind of statement that a man makes when he is genuinely afraid and has no other way to express it except to name the thing that scares him. Torres didn't answer immediately. He looked at Megan for a moment, then looked back at Hayes. I know, he said, and now she's covering our lives from 1,000 meters away. That sentence sat between them like something physical. Torres said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The commanding officer of Iron Wolf Commander Nathan Blake walked into the room and the energy shifted in the way it always did when Blake entered a space. He was not the tallest man in the room or the loudest, but he carried himself with the particular gravity of someone who had been making decisions that other people lived or died by for long enough that the weight of it had become part of his posture. Blake had hand-selected every person in this room. That included Megan Carter. He didn't explain his choices. He never did. Explanation implied doubt, and doubt was something Blake managed internally privately in the space between when he made a decision and when the decision was tested. He moved to the front of the room and looked at the assembled team. I'll keep this simple, he said. We have an American intelligence officer currently held at a fortified compound in northern Syria. His name is classified. His importance is not. He has been there for 11 days. We have a window that opens in roughly 72 hours and closes permanently 24 hours after that. He let that sit for a moment. The assault element goes in on the ground. The support elements cover from the air and from the high ground. He paused. Sniper overwatch position is here. He gestured toward the map without pointing directly at it because the room understood what he meant. 1,000-meter engagement range, single shooter. The rest of the team depends on that position being maintained with complete reliability from the moment we breach to the moment we extract. He looked around the room. Questions. Nobody asked any, not because they didn't have them, because the questions they had were not the kind that could be asked in front of the room. After the briefing broke, the operators moved into smaller clusters, the way they always did, sorting themselves into the familiar groupings of people who had been through enough together that proximity felt natural, that silence felt like communication. Megan gathered her folder and moved toward the door. Sullivan's voice stopped her. Carter, she turned. He was standing by the window, not aggressive, not unfriendly, just very, very direct. Sit down for a minute. She sat. Sullivan pulled a chair across the room and sat down across from her in a way that said clearly this is not a formal conversation. And also this is a conversation you should take seriously. You understand what this position requires, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Master Chief. Not what the briefing says it requires, what it actually requires. He leaned forward slightly. You're going to be alone up there. No backup, no second opinion. You're going to have maybe 3 seconds in some of those engagements to make a decision that affects 9 lives besides your own. And in those 3 seconds, you're going to feel things that training can prepare you for but cannot duplicate. He paused. The question I have for you is not whether you can make the shot. Megan waited. The question is whether you can make the decision to make the shot. Because those are 2 different things. And I have known shooters, good shooters, technical shooters, who could put a round through a coin at 800 meters in training and then freeze for half a second when the moment was real. He looked at her steadily. Half a second is an eternity. Megan held his gaze. I know, she said. Do you? My father told me something when I was 12 years old, and he was teaching me to shoot. She said it without preamble, without the kind of hesitation that people use when they're testing whether something sounds right. He said a rifle is not about pulling a trigger. It's about controlling yourself when the world is falling apart. Sullivan didn't respond immediately. He sat with that for a moment. Your father was a marksman, he said. Marine, 2 tours. Sullivan nodded slowly, not the nod of someone who was impressed, the nod of someone who was recalibrating. All right, he said. He stood up. The conversation was over. Megan stood as well. As she reached the door, Sullivan spoke again. You understand if you miss people date bay? She turned back. Yes, she said, just that. No elaboration, no reassurance, no performance. Sullivan looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't dismissal either. And in the hallway outside the briefing room, Hayes was waiting. Not intentionally, or maybe intentionally, she couldn't tell. He had the look of a man who wanted to say something and hadn't fully decided whether he was going to. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, you know, nobody here is trying to make this harder than it already is. She said, I know. It's just, he stopped. We've been in the field together a long time. Sullivan, Torres, me, Ramirez, Chen. We have a rhythm. We know each other's timing. We know each other's tendencies. He said it carefully, like a man who is explaining something factual and trying hard not to make it sound like an argument. You're coming into that from the outside. Megan looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said again. Hayes seemed to expect something more. Some kind of defense, maybe. Some version of the speech about merit and fairness and the right she had earned to stand in that room. She didn't give it to him because it wouldn't have been the right speech. The right answer wasn't in words. And she knew that. She had always known that. You didn't talk people into trust. You couldn't argue someone into believing you were reliable when the thing they needed was evidence. She walked past him down the hallway, and behind her, Hayes watched her go with an expression that was difficult to read, something between frustration and something that might, under different circumstances, have been the beginning of respect. The next 24 hours were preparation. Not the dramatic kind of preparation that looks good in photographs. The quiet, grinding, detail-oriented kind that makes the difference between a mission that works and a mission that doesn't. Megan went over the terrain data twice, then 3 times. She ran atmospheric calculations for the projected window building redundancy into every variable because in field conditions, no single variable stayed clean. She slept 4 hours, not because that was all she could manage. Because 4 hours was the correct amount to sleep for an operation that required her mind to be functional in the hours between 2 and 5 in the morning, when the human body's rhythms dip to their lowest, in the smallest thing, a miscalculated breath, a momentary loss of focus can become something irreversible. She ate correctly. She hydrated correctly. She ran through her mental protocols, the sequence of assessments, the priority of targets, the decision tree she had built over months of training that allowed her to reduce the chaos of a live engagement to a series of structured choices rather than reactions. Reactions got people killed. Structured choices saved lives. That was something she believed completely. She was checking her equipment for the 3rd time when Torres appeared in the doorway of the prep room. He leaned against the frame and watched her for a moment without speaking. She didn't look up. You need something, she asked. No. A pause. I just wanted to see if you actually sleep or if you're some kind of machine. She looked up at that. Torres had a face that didn't give much away, but there was something in his expression that was different from what she had seen in the briefing room. Not warmer exactly, less closed. I sleep, she said. 4 hours. It's the right amount. For who? For what I'm doing tomorrow. Torres was quiet for a moment. You calculate everything, he said. Not an insult, an observation. I try to. What do you do when the calculation falls apart? Because it will. She set down the component she was holding and looked at him directly. I use the thing underneath the calculation, she said, which is what? She thought about how to answer that honestly. The reason I'm here, she said, not the rank, not the assignment, the actual reason. She picked up the component again. When everything else fails, you go back to the reason. Torres looked at her for a long moment. He pushed off the door frame and turned to go. At the last second, he stopped and said without turning back, my little sister wanted to be a Marine. Megan waited. She's a surgeon now, pediatric surgery, saved 47 kids last year. He left. Megan sat with that for a long moment, not sure exactly what he had meant by it, not sure it required understanding. Some things people said to you were less about the words themselves and more about the fact of saying them. It was 4 a.m. when the weight of everything finally pressed down on her in a way that no amount of calculation could deflect. She sat alone in the prep room. The facility was quiet in that specific way that military installations get quiet in the hours before something important, not empty, because installations like this were never truly empty, but muted as though the building itself was conserving energy. She thought about the intelligence officer sitting in that compound. She didn't know his name. She wasn't supposed to, but she thought about him anyway. About what 11 days in enemy hands does to a person. About the way time probably moved for him, stretched and compressed in the specific horror of not knowing. She thought about what it would mean to fail, not as an abstract professional failure, as a real thing, a human thing. If she truly missed when it mattered, she would have to live with the precise knowledge of what that miss cost. Not a statistic, a person, possibly several persons, men who had families, men who had laughed at something last week and had no reason to believe they weren't going to laugh at something again next week. She sat with that. She didn't push it away. Her father had taught her that too, a lesson he'd learned the hard way and passed on with the particular care of a man who didn't want his daughter to learn it the same way he had. Don't pretend the weight isn't there, he had told her. Feel it completely, because the weight is information. It's telling you what matters. And if you know what matters, you know what to protect. She felt it completely. All of it. And then she took a slow breath and she set it aside, the way you set aside something you would tend to come back to, and she went over her calculations one more time. By the time the team assembled for final briefing, she was ready, not confident in the shallow sense of the word. Ready in the deeper sense, the sense that has nothing to do with feelings and everything to do with preparation. Blake ran the final brief in 11 minutes. Clean, precise, no wasted language. The team checked equipment, confirmed communications, confirmed timing. Sullivan moved through the room the way he always did before a mission, not checking anything specific, just present a kind of distributed attention that had become, after years of practice, something close to instinct. He paused near Megan's position. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her equipment setup, then at her, and nodded once. It was not a large gesture. It was exactly the right gesture. Hayes was across the room running through his own checklist. He glanced over once. Their eyes met for half a second. He looked away first. The briefing closed. The team began to move. And as Megan picked up her rifle and walked toward the door, with the rest of Iron Wolf not ahead of them, not behind them, but among them, she felt something settle in her chest that wasn't quite calmness and wasn't quite resolve. It was something that didn't have a precise name. The closest word might have been readiness, or purpose, or the feeling that comes when everything you've worked for has finally arrived at the moment it was built for, and the only thing left to do is be exactly who you have spent your whole life becoming. Outside, the night was dark and cold and very still. The kind of still that doesn't last. She moved into it without hesitation. And behind her, without quite knowing why, Ryan Hayes watched her go, and for the first time since she had walked into that briefing room, he did not feel doubt. He felt something that surprised him. He felt the beginning of a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. What if they had all been wrong about her from the very first second? What if the person they had all quietly, carefully, professionally dismissed was the one person they couldn't afford to lose? He didn't say it out loud. But it was there, and it didn't go away. The night swallowed them whole. Megan moved through the darkness at a pace that her body had memorized long before her mind understood why. Not fast, not slow. The specific rhythm of someone who knows that arriving correctly matters more than arriving quickly. Every footfall calculated, every breath controlled. The weight of her rifle across her back was so familiar by now that it had stopped feeling like an object and started feeling like an extension of something deeper, like the part of herself that existed in the space between thought and action. Behind her, Iron Wolf moved as a unit. She could hear them without turning around. The soft, disciplined sounds of a team that had operated together long enough to move like a single organism. The slight compression of a boot against hard soil. The almost imperceptible adjustment of gear. The silence between breaths that told her everyone was alert, focused, locked into the same frequency of concentration. She was not behind them or ahead of them. She was among them. But she was also alone in the way that a sniper is always alone carrying a responsibility that no amount of teamwork can distribute a weight that sits on one set of shoulders and one set of shoulders only. Sullivan's voice came through the team channel at exactly the moment she expected it. 2 kilometers to the ridge, maintain interval, radio discipline from here. Acknowledgements came back in the compressed, efficient code of a team that had done this enough times that even their communication had been stripped of everything unnecessary. Megan said nothing. Her position on the channel was not silent because she was uncertain. It was silent because she was already calculating. The ridge Sullivan had mentioned was not just a physical destination. It was the beginning of a separation, the point at which she would peel away from the team and begin the solitary climb to her overwatch position while Iron Wolf continued toward the objective. From that point forward, they would be connected only by radio and by the precision of her rifle. She thought about that while she walked, not with fear. Fear was not the word for what she felt. It was something more precise, something that had no clean name but lived in the chest just below the sternum, in the place where breath originates. The awareness of consequence, the knowledge that what happened in the next several hours would be real in the most irreducible sense of that word. Not a simulation, not a training exercise, wrapped in real-world data. Real. Torres moved up beside her for approximately 40 seconds. Not to talk, just to be present in the way that people who have been through difficult things together sometimes are offering proximity as a form of communication when words would cost more than they're worth. Then he dropped back. She didn't acknowledge it. She didn't need to. The first 30 minutes passed in that compressed, purposeful silence. Then the team leader's voice came through again. Approaching split point, sniper, you're separating in 200 meters. Copy, Megan said. It was the first word she had spoken since they left the assembly point. Hayes, moving near the middle of the element, heard her voice on the channel and felt something shift in him that he couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't the voice itself, it was the quality of it. Steady, not performed steadiness, not the careful, constructed calm of someone managing their fear through sheer discipline. Something that came from a deeper place than management. He filed that away without deciding what to do with it. 200 meters later, the team reached the split point. Blake appeared beside Megan. He was close enough that she could see the details of his face in the low ambient light. And what she saw there was not the expression of a commander running through a checklist. It was something more personal. The look of a man who had made a decision he believed in and was now standing at the moment where belief becomes irrelevant, where only reality counts. You have the high ground, he said quietly. Everything that happens down there depends on what happens up there. Understood, she said. I need you at your position in 40 minutes. I'll be there in 35. Blake looked at her. 35, he said. Not a question, not approval, just the acknowledgement of a man who had just been given information he intended to hold someone to. He rejoined the team. Megan turned and began to climb. The separation from the team was not dramatic. There were no words. Hayes looked at her for a moment as she turned that same complicated expression she had seen in the hallway after the briefing, and then he was moving with the team, and she was moving alone, and the distance between her and every other person she was responsible for began to grow. She climbed. The terrain was not easy. It never was in the places where Overwatch positions needed to exist because those positions had to be high enough and isolated enough to be useful, which meant reaching them required exactly the kind of effort that a person carrying a precision rifle and full kit could least afford to waste. She managed her breathing with the precision of someone who understood that controlled exertion over a significant climb was its own form of preparation, that arriving at the ridge depleted would cost her in the moments when depletion mattered most. 12 minutes into the climb, her earpiece carried Sullivan's voice. Sniper, sit rep. Ascending, on schedule. Copy. Team is at the 2-kilometer mark. No contact. Copy. She kept moving. 18 minutes in, she crossed a section of terrain that required both hands, which meant a period where the radio was the only connection she had to the team, and the team was operating on the assumption that she was progressing as promised. That kind of trust, the kind that operates in the absence of confirmation, was different from every other kind. It didn't ask for evidence. It simply extended itself forward into the dark and assumed that the evidence would come. She thought about that as she climbed, about what it meant that Sullivan had simply said copy when she confirmed she was on schedule. Not be careful, not check in every 5 minutes, not any of the dozens of things that a commander says when he is managing someone he doesn't quite trust. Just copy. Maybe that was something. Maybe it wasn't. She filed it with everything else and kept moving. 29 minutes after she left the team, she reached the ridge. She was 6 minutes ahead of the timeline she had given Blake. She did not announce this. She settled into her position with the practiced efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this specific sequence enough times that the individual steps had merged into a single fluid movement. Scope check, range, verification, atmospheric reading position, adjustment, a communication check. Overwatch position established, she said into the radio. Blake's voice came back immediately. Copy that. We are 6 minutes from breach point. Maintain observation and hold for green light. Copy, I have the compound. And she did. Through her scope, the compound was exactly what the intelligence had shown her. and also something more in the way that real things are always something more than their representations. The structure was solid. The guard positions were where she expected them. The vehicles were parked in the configuration the satellite imagery had shown. Everything was as planned. That was the first warning sign, though she didn't know it yet. In her experience, everything as planned in the first minutes of an operation was less often a good sign than it was the setup for something you hadn't planned for. She held the thought loosely and maintained her observation. On the ground, Iron Wolf was moving through the final approach, a carefully timed sequence that Blake had rehearsed with the team until each person could have executed it in total darkness, which was essentially what they were doing. The approach used terrain masking to stay outside the visual range of the guard positions Megan could see, trusting that she would alert them if anything changed. Nothing changed. For 4 minutes, nothing changed. And then everything changed. It began with lights. Not all the lights in the compound that would have been obvious, a clear alarm signal. It was subtler than that, individual lights in positions that didn't need lighting for normal guard operations. A vehicle parked near the eastern wall that shifted position by approximately 40 meters, not moving toward the gate, not moving toward any apparent destination, just repositioning in a way that suggested deliberate placement rather than routine movement. Megan watched these changes accumulate. Her breathing didn't change, her heart rate didn't change, but her attention sharpened in the specific way that attention sharpens when your training is telling you something that hasn't yet assembled itself into a complete thought when the pattern exists but hasn't declared itself. "Command Overwatch," she said. Blake's voice was immediate. "Send it." Vehicle repositioned on the east wall, lights in non-standard positions. Pattern is inconsistent with the intelligence picture. A beat of silence. How long has this been developing? 4 minutes, gradual, deliberate. Another beat. "Your read." She didn't hesitate. "They know we're coming." The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Sullivan's voice clipped and precise. "Command Overwatch assessment is consistent with secondary intel we received 40 minutes ago. 2-source confirmation of possible compromise." Blake said, "All elements hold position." The entire operation froze. On the ridge, Megan kept watching. The compound continued its subtle, deliberate reorganization. It was elegant, she thought, in the way that a well-designed trap is elegant, not aggressive, not obvious, designed to draw the approaching element close enough that the trap's full geometry could express itself before anyone understood what was happening. She mapped it as she watched. The vehicle on the east wall, the repositioned guards not in the obvious positions, not on the walls where they would be visible to approaching observation, but in covered positions that would be invisible until the assault team was already inside the outer perimeter. The lights, which were not illuminating the compound for defensive purposes, but were positioned to silhouette any force approaching from the north, the exact approach Vector Iron Wolf was using. Someone had done their homework. Someone knew or had reasoned correctly how Iron Wolf would approach this target. "Command Overwatch," she said, "send it." "They're not reacting to us. They prepared for us. The guard repositioning is preset. They have covered positions in the northeast quadrant specifically designed to engage a force approaching from our current vector." Blake's voice was quiet and very controlled. "How many covered positions?" "Minimum 3, possibly 4. I cannot confirm the 4th without them revealing it, which they won't do until the assault element is committed." A pause, then Hayes' voice came onto the channel. Not panic. Hayes did not panic, but something close to the edge of a feeling that hadn't fully formed yet. "If we pull back now, we lose the window." Blake said, "I know." The officer, "I know what we lose, Hayes." A silence. Torres spoke next, and his voice was the flattest in the channel, which somehow made it carry more weight than anything else. "What's the sniper's assessment of the engagement solution from Overwatch?" Everyone on the channel understood what he was actually asking. He wasn't asking whether the positions could be neutralized. He was asking whether Megan could neutralize them, alone, before the assault team committed, in a sequence timed so precisely that the covered positions would be cleared before they could engage Iron Wolf. It was not a small thing to ask. Megan was already running the calculation. 3 confirmed positions, a possible 4th. Each position needed to be engaged in a sequence that accounted for the fact that the second she fired, every person in that compound would know where the shot came from and would respond accordingly. which meant the first shot had to reveal as little about her position as possible, and each subsequent shot had to be faster than the enemy's ability to redirect. At this range, in these atmospheric conditions with the wind, she had been reading for the past 20 minutes. "I can clear 3 confirmed positions in sequence," she said. "The fourth, if it exists, I cannot guarantee without movement." Movement meant changing her position after engaging, which meant exposing herself to detection. "What's your confidence on the 3?" Blake asked. "High." "Define high." "I will not miss." The words came out clean and simple and without performance. Not a boast, a statement of fact from someone who had done the calculation and arrived at a conclusion. Another silence. Hayes said very quietly to no one in particular, and everyone on the channel, "She said she won't miss." Nobody responded to that. Blake said, "Overwatch, you're going to hold for 3 minutes while I run the alternate approach. If the alternate is viable, we move. If not, I need your engagement solution ready to execute on my mark." "Copy," Megan said. "Solution is ready." 3 minutes. In field time, 3 minutes is either nothing or everything. Megan used those 3 minutes the way she used every available interval, not resting, not worrying, but observing, continuing to build the picture, continuing to refine the sequence. The fourth position was the problem. She kept working the geometry, looking for the angle that would let her see it, knowing that the angle probably existed, but that finding it from her current position might not be possible. She found it. Not the position itself, she still couldn't confirm the fourth fighter was there, but the angle that would let her see it if she moved 6 meters to her left along the ridge. 6 meters that would take her out of her primary shooting position and into terrain that would require her to reestablish after each engagement. She was still working through the implications of that when Blake came back. "Alternate approach is not viable. They have coverage on both vectors." A pause that contained a decision. "Overwatch, I need you to clear those positions." "Copy. On your ready." She settled into her primary position. Wind calculation complete, distance confirmed, sequence locked. She found the first target. And here was the moment that Sullivan had asked her about in that quiet room the day before. The moment between the decision and the action. The moment where training ends and something else begins. The moment where the weight of what you are about to do either breaks you or doesn't. She breathed out, slow, complete, and fired. The first shot was clean. The guard on the northeast wall dropped before any other person in the compound had processed the sound. Megan was already moving to the second target. She found it in 4 seconds. Fired. The second covered position went silent. On the team channel, she heard Blake say not to her, but clearly audible, "She's moving." 3 seconds to the third position. This one was harder, partially obscured. The angle was not perfect. In a training environment, it would have been the shot that instructors use to illustrate the difference between the achievable and the optimal, the kind of shot that exists in the gray area where statistics matter. Megan did not think about statistics. She thought about what her father had taught her. Control yourself when the world is falling apart. She fired. The third position went quiet. 3 confirmed, she reported. Her voice had not changed. Her breathing had not changed. She was already moving left 6 meters, repositioning for the fourth. On the ground, Hayes was listening to her voice on the channel and feeling something happen to him that he didn't have language for yet. He would find the language later. But right now, it was just a feeling, the particular feeling of realizing that you had fundamentally misunderstood something important. Blake said, "Elements prepare to move on Overwatch." Confirmation. Megan reached her new position, found the fourth angle, looked through the scope. The fourth position was real. A fighter well covered in exactly the location she had suspected. And he was moving not in response to her shots, not yet, but in the pattern of someone who was about to transition from waiting to acting. Someone who had heard something and was preparing to respond even before he had confirmed what he was responding to. She had approximately 4 seconds. She fired. "Fourth confirmed," she said. "Compound is clear for breach on the primary vector." A half-second silence. Then Blake's voice with a quality in it she had never heard from him before. "Iron Wolf, move." The team moved, and on the ridge, Megan kept her scope on the compound and felt the particular suspended quality of the moment after decisive action, the moment where the world catches up to what has just happened, and both possible futures The one where it worked and the one where it didn't exist simultaneously until reality collapses, the waveform into the one that's actually true. She watched. She waited. Iron Wolf hit the outer perimeter. No resistance. The primary approach was clear. She heard the breach go in through her earpiece, the compressed, efficient radio traffic of a team executing on a plan that was actually working, actually holding together every element, moving as designed. Then, we have the package. Package is secure, prepare for extract. She exhaled. Not relief, not yet. Extract was its own sequence, its own set of vulnerabilities. But something. The acknowledgement that the thing she had prepared for had arrived and she had met it. And then Hayes's voice came onto the channel, not a report, not part of the tactical traffic, just Hayes talking, which almost never happened during an active operation. And what he said was not directed at anyone specifically, but at everyone on the frequency. She actually did it. Not surprise exactly. Not the condescension of someone who had expected failure and was grudgingly acknowledging success. Something rawer than that. The voice of a man who had believed one thing about someone and was in the process of discovering that he had been wrong and who was not trying to manage how that discovery sounded. Sullivan's voice came back dry and flat. Copy, Hayes. A pause, then Torres with just enough of something in his voice that you could hear it if you were listening. Yeah, she did. On the ridge, Megan heard all of it. She didn't respond. She maintained her scope on the compound while the extract sequence ran, watching the vehicle approaches, tracking the withdrawal, performing every function she was there to perform. But something happened in her chest in that moment. Not pride, that wasn't quite it. Pride would come later, maybe in the quiet of a debrief room or a hotel room or the particular stillness of the moment before sleep after something enormous. This was different. This was the feeling of being seen. Not celebrated, not applauded, just seen, accurately, by people whose seeing carried weight because of what they had been through, and who they were, and how rarely they saw in a way that changed their minds. Ryan Hayes' voice saying she actually did it. It was 3 words. It was everything. The extract went clean. Iron Wolf pulled the intelligence officer out of the compound 19 minutes after Megan's 4th shot. By the time the enemy's command element had processed what had happened and dispatched a response, the team was already outside the response radius. At the extraction point, Megan came off the ridge and rejoined the element. She was carrying her rifle and moving at the pace of someone who had just spent 45 minutes in a high concentration state, which meant she was running on the specific kind of adrenaline that doesn't feel like adrenaline, that feels like clarity, like the world has been sharpened to its essential components and all the noise has fallen away. The team was assembling around the vehicles. Torres was there, Chen, Ramirez, Sullivan, who was moving through the team in that particular way of his accounting for each person. He got to Megan and stopped. He looked at her. He said, "Your father would be proud." She didn't have a response for that, not an immediate one. It hit something she hadn't been prepared for, something beneath the operational surface in the part of her that had been carrying her father's voice through every step of the last several hours. She managed, "Thank you, Master Chief." Sullivan nodded once and moved on, and then Hayes was there. The same man who had whispered doubts in the briefing room, the same man who had stopped her in the hallway and carefully, professionally explained why her being there made him afraid. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a moment. He said, I owe you an apology." "You don't," she said. "Yeah, I do." He said it simply. No performance, no management. "I spent the whole time wondering if you could keep up. That it was wrong, and I knew it was wrong by the time we hit the breach." He paused. "I just wanted to say it out loud." Megan looked at him. In the pre-dawn dark, with the dust of the operation still on both of them and the sounds of the extraction still resolving around them, Hayes looked exactly like what he was, a very good soldier who had made an honest mistake and was standing in it without trying to make it smaller than it was. "I appreciate that," she said. "For what it's worth," he said, the 4th shot. She waited. "How long did you have?" 4 seconds. He absorbed that, nodded slowly. 4 seconds, he repeated. It wasn't admiration in the way that people perform admiration. It was the specific acknowledgement of someone who understood exactly what 4 seconds meant in that context, who had done enough difficult things to know what that margin of time costs a person, what it requires, what it demands. Yeah, he said, just that. And then Blake was there, and the team was consolidating around the vehicles, and the intelligence officer was being evaluated by the medical element, and the 100 operational details of the extract were resolving themselves into the standard machinery of mission closure. But before Blake turned to the vehicle, he looked directly at Megan. He said Iron Wolf Sniper, not her name, her title. The designation of her role in this team, spoken by the man who commanded this team in front of every member of this team. It was, she understood the way that Nathan Blake said welcome. She stood a little straighter, not with pride, with the weight of something earned. The vehicles began to move. And in the seat beside her, Torres looked straight ahead into the dark and said quietly enough that only she could hear it, 47 kids last year. My sister saves them because she's exactly where she's supposed to be. He paused. Same thing. Megan looked at him. He didn't look back. But there was something in his profile, something in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his expression that told her the statement was not casual, that he had been sitting with it since the corridor outside the prep room, since the conversation where she had told him about the reason beneath the calculation, and that this was his way of completing the thought. She turned back to the window. Outside, the night was beginning to soften at the edges, not light yet, but the first suggestion of it. The specific quality of darkness that exists in the hour before dawn, when the world is still dark but has already decided to change. She thought about the intelligence officer in the vehicle behind them, about what it meant to have been in that compound for 11 days and then to be in a vehicle moving away from it, about the particular impossibility of that transition from one reality to another, the seam between them so sharp that you could almost see it. She thought about Viktor Volkov. The name had come up twice in the pre-mission briefing in language so indirect that someone not paying close attention might have missed it. Former Russian Special Forces, the architect of the compound's defensive arrangement, the person who had designed the trap that Iron Wolf had just walked into and out of. He had anticipated almost everything. The approach vector, the timing, the number of shooters in the assault element, the equipment load, the communication protocols. He had been extraordinarily prepared, and he had still failed. She thought about why. Not tactically, she could run the tactical analysis in her sleep. She thought about the deeper reason, the assumption underneath the preparation. He had anticipated the team. He had not anticipated her. Not her, specifically her as an unknown. Her as the variable he hadn't fully accounted for. Because the variable wasn't just a sniper with exceptional scores. The variable was someone who, when the fourth position revealed itself with 4 seconds to act, had not hesitated. Not because she wasn't afraid, not because the weight of it wasn't real, but because the reason beneath the calculation was strong enough to hold. She filed that thought away. It would matter later. She didn't know yet how much. The vehicle moved through the dark. The team rode in the particular silence of people who have been through something together and are not yet ready to talk about it, who are still inside it, still processing, still running the sequence in their heads, the way you always do in the hours after an operation, checking for the things you might have done differently, the decisions that held and the ones that almost didn't. Sullivan was in the front seat. He said nothing. But at one point, roughly 20 minutes into the drive, he turned his head slightly toward the back of the vehicle, not to look at anyone specific, just the gesture of a man who was accounting for the people in his care. He turned back. The silence continued. And in it, in the specific quality of that silence, in the way that no one said anything, because nothing needed to be said. Megan felt the thing that had been forming since Hayes' voice on the radio, since Torres's words in the vehicle, since Blake had said her title in front of the whole team. She felt it settle, complete. She was Iron Wolf. Not because they had decided to accept her, not because she had asked for it, not because anything official had been said or signed or formally recognized, but because she had been in the field with them, because she had been in the dark with them, because when it had mattered most, she had been exactly who she was. And that she understood now in a way she hadn't fully understood before was the only thing that had ever actually mattered. Outside the vehicle, the darkness was giving way. Slowly, inevitably, the way all darkness eventually does. The debrief room smelled like industrial coffee and exhaustion. It was 6:47 in the morning. When Iron Wolf assembled around the long table and the light coming through the narrow windows had the flat, colorless quality of a day that hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. Everyone in the room had been awake for more than 24 hours. Everyone in the room wore that fact differently. Hayes with a particular stillness that he put on like armor when his body was running on reserves. Torres with a focused quiet that seemed to deepen rather than erode under fatigue. Sullivan with absolutely no visible sign of anything, which was somehow the most unsettling response of all. Megan sat at the far end of the table, not because she was excluded, because she had chosen it. The far end gave her the whole room, the whole table, every face. Old habit, a sniper's instinct applied to interior spaces. Blake stood at the front. He had a tablet in his hand and the expression of a man who was about to say something that the room was not going to like. The operation was successful, he said. Package is secure. Team is intact. Those are the facts that matter most. He set the tablet down on the table. Now here is the fact that should concern every person in this room. He let that land. We walked into a trap that was constructed with specific knowledge of our operational approach. Not general knowledge, specific. Our vector, our timing sequence, our communication window. The guard repositioning that Overwatch identified was not a coincidence, and it was not improvised. It was preset, deliberate. He paused. Someone gave Viktor Volkov enough information about how Iron Wolf operates to design a kill box around us. The room absorbed this. Hayes leaned forward. Are we talking about a leak? I'm talking about the possibility, Blake said carefully, which means for the next 72 hours, everything we know about the next operation stays in this room and goes nowhere else. Sullivan said, what do we know about Volkov's preparation timeline? Analysts are working it. Current estimate puts his preparation at 5 to 7 days, which means the intelligence that fed him predates our operational orders by at least 48 hours. Blake looked around the table. This is above our pay grade in terms of the sourcing investigation. What is not above our pay grade is understanding what we're dealing with going forward. Torres said, he'll try again. Blake nodded. He'll try again. The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when the implication of a statement is large enough that processing it takes a moment. Megan had been listening to all of this with the same quality of attention she applied to everything. Not passive, not performative, but genuinely present, taking in every word and storing it alongside the calculations she had been running since the vehicle ride back, since the moment she had thought about Volkov's failure, since the realization that had settled in her during those 20 minutes of dark road he had not accounted for her. She said he knew the sniper position. The room turned toward her, not all at once, but the shift in attention was unmistakable. She continued. The vehicle that repositioned on the east wall, it wasn't covering the assault vector. It was carrying detection equipment pointed at my Overwatch position. She looked at Blake. He knew there would be a sniper. He knew the approximate range. He placed that vehicle to find me after my first shot. Sullivan's eyes narrowed slightly. You're saying the trap had 2 layers, he said. I'm saying the trap had at least 2 layers. The ground-level kill box for the assault element and a secondary element designed to locate and eliminate the sniper after she revealed her position. She paused. He expected me to fire once and stay put. Standard doctrine. He expected to triangulate my position from the first shot and have someone move on it before I could engage the second target. Hayes said slowly, but you moved between shots. Yes. A silence. Torres said, that's not standard doctrine. No, Megan said, it's not. She said it simply. No elaboration, no performance. Just the fact. Blake was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the gravity of command. Something closer to the look of a man reassessing the structure of something he thought he understood. He underestimated you, Blake said. He underestimated the variable, she said. He planned for a sniper who follows standard doctrine because standard doctrine is what you plan for when you're building a trap. You don't plan for the deviation. You can't because the deviation is by definition the thing you didn't anticipate. Sullivan said very quietly, that's why you're still alive. That's why we're all still alive, she said. Another silence, different from the first one, denser. Hayes looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked at Megan. You knew he was going to try to locate you. I didn't know, she said honestly. I assessed it as a possibility based on the vehicle placement. I moved as a precaution. In the middle of an engagement sequence. Yes, Hayes absorbed this. You changed your position between the second and third shot, under fire while running a four-target sequence, as a precaution. Yes. He looked at Sullivan. Sullivan returned the look but said nothing. Blake said, all right, here's where we are. The analysts will work the source question. Our job is to work the Volkov question because Volkov is not finished. He picked up the tablet again. He has the resources, the patience, and now the specific motivation to come at us again. And the next time he will have adjusted his model. Blake looked directly at Megan, which means he will account for the deviation. The implication was clear. The thing that had saved them the unpredictability of the variable was now known to Volkov. He would build it into his next calculation. Megan said, then we need to be a different kind of unpredictable. Blake said, yes, we do. The debrief ran another 40 minutes. By the time it closed, the exhaustion in the room had deepened from the kind that can be managed to the kind that requires actual sleep, and Blake released the team with orders to stand down for 6 hours and reassemble at 1300. Megan walked out of the debrief room and found Torres waiting in the corridor. He fell into step beside her without explanation. They walked in silence for a moment. Then Torres said, the detection vehicle. How long did you have between identifying it and knowing you needed to move? About 90 seconds. And you made the call to deviate from the sequence in 90 seconds. 80 maybe. Torres nodded slowly. Most shooters would have stayed put, he said. It wasn't criticism, it was observation. The kind that carries weight precisely because it isn't trying to. Most shooters would have been right to stay put, she said. Standard doctrine exists because it works most of the time. Deviating from it under fire has costs. You lose your position anchor. You have to reestablish. Every shot after the deviation is harder than it would have been from the original position. But Volkov had the original position built into his plan. Staying put meant giving him exactly what he designed the trap to find. Torres was quiet for a moment. How did you know he had the position? I didn't know. I felt the geometry was wrong. He stopped walking. She stopped too. He looked at her. You deviated from doctrine in the middle of a live engagement sequence based on a feeling. Based on a calculation that was moving faster than I could fully articulate in the moment, she said, which from the outside looks like a feeling. Torres stared at her for a second. Then he laughed. Not loud, not the laugh of someone who found something funny, the laugh of someone who had just encountered something that exceeded the category they had built for it. Okay, he said. Okay, I was wrong about you too. She looked at him. Not in the same way as Hayes, he said. Hayes thought you couldn't do the job. I thought you could do the job, but that you would need time to find the rhythm, to fit the way Iron Wolf operates. He paused. I was wrong about what you were. What did you think I was? A very good technician who would become, over time, an exceptional operator. He started walking again. That's not what you are. She walked beside him. What am I? He thought about it for a moment. The kind of thinking that isn't performance, that actually takes time, because the question is real. You're someone who thinks differently than everyone else in that room, he said. Not better, different. In a way that produces results that standard thinking can't produce. And that's rarer than a perfect score on a marksmanship qualification. She didn't respond to that. Not because she didn't have a response, because the response would have been inadequate. Some things people say to you carry more weight in the silence after them than they would in any answer. They separated at the quarter junction. She went to her quarters and slept for exactly 6 hours. Not because that was what she felt like doing, because it was the correct thing to do. She woke at 12:40 with the specific alertness of someone whose body has been trained to transition cleanly from sleep to full function, no fog, no gradual return, present immediately the way she needed to be. She lay still for 30 seconds, running, not exercise, the sequence, everything from the moment she had separated from Iron Wolf at the split point, every decision, every adjustment, every shot. She did this after every operation. Ran the recording from beginning to end and looked for the places where she could have been better. Not the places where she had succeeded, the places where she could have been faster, cleaner, more precise. She found two. The third shot, the angle had been imperfect. She had made it work, but she had allowed the angle to be imperfect when 20 additional seconds of position selection would have given her a better line. She had prioritized speed over geometry and gotten away with it. Getting away with something was not the same as doing it correctly. The second thing was the detection vehicle. She had identified it in time. She had acted on the identification. But she had taken 90 seconds to reach her decision, when in retrospect, the indicators had been present at 60 seconds. She had held the assessment an extra 30 seconds, looking for confirmation of something she already knew. 30 seconds in a live engagement was not 30 seconds. She filed both findings in the part of her mind reserved for things that needed to change. Then she got up, dressed, and went to the 1300 reassembly. The room was different from the morning debrief. Not in its physical composition, same table, same people, same flat, afternoon light, but in its energy. The 6 hours of sleep had changed something. Not softened it, sharpened it. The specific clarity that comes when exhaustion has been replaced by rest and the mind returns to full function, with the events of the previous day still present, but now accessible rather than pressing. Blake was already at the front. Sullivan was already in his chair. Hayes was talking quietly to Ramirez near the window. They stopped when Megan came in. Hayes looked at her and nodded. Not the careful, measured nod of someone managing their response. Just a nod, the kind you give to someone who is simply there and belongs there. Small thing, not small. Blake started at exactly 1300. Volkov, he said, here's what the analysts have built in the last 6 hours. He brought up a series of documents on the room screen, not images, not maps, but text, heavy intelligence assessments that required reading rather than glancing at. Viktor Volkov, 43 years old, former Spetsnaz Group Alpha, left official service 11 years ago. Since then, he has operated as a contractor, the specific kind of contractor who does not advertise and does not take work that doesn't pay extremely well. Blake looked at the room. He has been connected with varying degrees of confidence to 4 previous operations against Western Special Operations elements. In 3 of those 4 cases, the Western element took casualties. In one case, the element was destroyed entirely. A silence. Hayes said, "What was the one they survived?" Blake looked at him. They survived because the sniper did something Volkov didn't expect. The room absorbed this. Megan felt the weight of it. Not the flattery of it. She was not thinking about herself in that sentence. She was thinking about what it revealed about Volkov, about the pattern, about a man who built elaborate, well-researched traps that worked against predictable opposition and failed against unpredictable opposition. He was brilliant within his model. The question was, what his model looked like now that it included her? Sullivan said, "He's going to want to correct the failure." "Yes," Blake said. "He's going to want to study her." "Yes," which means he's going to try to create a situation where he can observe how she operates. Blake nodded. And here was the first large twist of the afternoon, the thing that nobody in the room had seen coming because the intelligence hadn't pointed toward it, and the logic of the situation didn't obviously lead there. Blake said, "Volkov made contact 2 hours ago." The room went very still. Not directly, through an intermediary that our intelligence community has been tracking for 3 years. The situation didn't obviously lead there. Blake said, "Volkov made contact 2 hours ago." The room went very still. Not directly, through an intermediary that our intelligence community has been tracking for 3 years. The contact was a message delivered through a channel that both sides understand is monitored, which means the message was intended to be intercepted. Blake looked around the table. He wants to negotiate the release of 2 individuals currently held by a partner nation. In exchange, he will provide information about the intelligence compromise that fed him our operational details. A beat. Torres said, "That's not a negotiation. That's bait." "Yes," Blake said. "He wants us to respond. He wants to see how we respond. He wants to observe our decision-making process." And specifically, Sullivan said, his voice flat and precise, he wants to observe the sniper's decision-making process. Because she's the variable he failed to calculate, and the only way to recalibrate his model is to gather more data on how she operates. The room turned toward Megan. She had been listening to all of this with the stillness that people in the room were beginning to recognize as her specific form of active engagement. Not passivity, the opposite of passivity. She said, "He thinks I'll be cautious now." "Explain," Blake said. "He designed a trap that almost worked. He came closer than most people would have. He knows that, and he knows that I know that." She looked at the table for a moment, then back at Blake. "The standard psychological response to a near miss is increased caution. He's betting that I'll pull back, that I'll be more conservative, that the knowledge of how close he came will make me hesitate." "Will it?" Blake asked. She looked at him directly. "No," she said. Blake studied her for a moment. "Why not?" "Because hesitation is the thing that makes the next trap work. He needs me to hesitate. He built a message to create conditions that encourage hesitation. He's offering something we want, which creates a decision environment where the natural response is to slow down, to evaluate carefully, to weigh options." She paused. "That's the trap, not the negotiation itself, the pace of the response." Sullivan looked at her. "You're saying the negotiation is a timing mechanism. I'm saying the negotiation is designed to shift our operational tempo from fast to deliberate, and the moment we shift tempo is the moment he has his observation window." The room was quiet, and Hayes said very quietly, "How do you do that?" Not a question, not exactly. The kind of statement that comes out as a question because the person making it is genuinely uncertain whether what they just heard is as extraordinary as it sounds, or whether they are simply hearing it with ears that are not calibrated correctly. Sullivan answered without looking at Hayes. "That's what she does," he said. It was the first time Sullivan had said anything like that about Megan. In front of the room, without qualification. She heard it and let it settle somewhere deep. Blake said, "So we don't respond to the negotiation message. We respond immediately," Megan said, "faster than he expects. We don't give him the deliberate pace he's designed for. We collapse his observation window before he can use it." Blake thought about this. And the response itself, unexpected. Something outside his model of how Iron Wolf operates. Something that tells him the variable is still in play and has not become cautious. "You're talking about running at him," Torres said. "I'm talking about being the thing he can't calculate," she said. "Which means not being the thing he expects me to be. Ever." The silence that followed was the longest one of the afternoon. Blake said, "All right, here's what we're going to do." He began to lay out a course of action that was from the outside a response to Volkov's message, but was in its structure something more complex. A response that contained within it a second signal embedded in the timing and the specific wording that would tell anyone reading it carefully that the element responding had not slowed down, had not become cautious, was still operating at the pace of someone who had not been shaken by what had happened. It was, Megan thought, a form of communication. One professional to another, not threatening, not aggressive, simply honest. "I am still here. I have not changed. Come and find me if you want to." The meeting broke at 15:30. As the team filed out, Hayes fell into step beside Megan in the corridor. He walked with her for a moment without speaking. "Then can I ask you something?" "Yes." "The 4 seconds," he said. "With the fourth position. When you had 4 seconds to decide and execute, what were you thinking about?" She considered the question seriously, not performing consideration and actually thinking about what had been happening in those 4 seconds, because it was worth thinking about accurately. "I wasn't thinking," she said. Hayes waited. Everything before those 4 seconds was thinking. The calculation, the position assessment, the wind, the angle, all of that was thinking. By the time I had 4 seconds, the thinking was done. What happened in those 4 seconds was just being where I had put myself. Hayes walked beside her in silence for a moment. "Being where you had put yourself," he repeated. "Everything before the moment prepares you for the moment," she said. "And then the moment is just the moment. You're either ready or you're not. The 4 seconds aren't where it happens. The 4 seconds are just the last 4 seconds." Hayes thought about that. They reached the junction in the corridor. He stopped. "You know something," he said. She looked at him. When Blake said Iron Wolf sniper at the extract point, the way he said it, Hayes looked at her steadily. "I've been with this team 4 years. I have never heard him use someone's designation like that. Not like that, he paused. That's not something he does for people who've been done their job. That's something he does for people who've become part of something. She didn't respond immediately, because the response required something she wasn't sure she was ready to say out loud. The thing she had felt in the vehicle. The thing that had settled in her chest. I know, she said quietly. Hayes nodded. He started to turn. Hayes, she said, he turned back. You told me in the hallway before the mission that you had a rhythm, that the team knew each other's timing. She paused. You were right about that. He waited. What you didn't know was that I had been studying that rhythm for 6 weeks before this mission. Hayes stared at her. 6 weeks, Denise said. Every after-action report I could access, every training record, every observable pattern in the operational data. She said it without apology and without modesty, simply as information. I didn't know your team from the inside, so I built the model from the outside. Hayes looked at her for a long moment. Does Blake know that? Blake assigned me to the mission, she said. I don't know what Blake knows. Hayes thought about this. You studied us, he said. I studied the team I was going to be responsible for. Something moved through Hayes' expression that she watched carefully, the specific movement of a thought traveling through a mind that is in the process of revising itself. Not slowly, quickly, the way revision happens when the new information is undeniable. That's why you knew the timing, and he said. During the engagement, when you were moving between positions, the timing you used was it matched our breach sequence. Yes. You timed your shots to our movement so that our exposure windows were covered. Yes, Hayes stood very still. That's not standard Overwatch doctrine, he said. No, standard Overwatch covers fixed positions. Covering moving elements in a breach sequence requires knowing the movement. She paused, which requires knowing the team. Hayes looked at her with an expression that she had not yet seen from him. It was not admiration, not exactly. It was something more complicated. The look of a man who has built a structure of understanding and is watching in real time as the foundation of that structure is replaced with something more solid. The disorientation that comes not from being wrong, but from discovering that wrong and right were not the categories that mattered. The category that mattered was complete. He had been incomplete in his understanding of her. He was becoming complete. He said, You never planned to just cover the position. No, you planned to cover the team. Yes, he exhaled slowly. This whole time, he said, this whole time from the moment you sat down in that briefing room. I was there to cover the team, she said. That was always the whole thing. Hayes stood in the corridor for another moment. Then he said something that she would carry with her for a very long time. He said, I'm sorry it took me this long to see it. Not the apology he had offered at the extract point. That one had been about doubt. This one was about something deeper. About the specific kind of blindness that comes not from bad intention, but from incomplete vision. The apology of someone who understood that the failure was in the seeing, not the judging. She looked at him. You saw it when it mattered, she said. He thought about that, nodded, and walked away down the corridor. Megan stood alone at the junction for a moment. Somewhere in the building, Volkov's intercepted message was being analyzed by people whose job was to find the layers within layers. Somewhere in a partner nation's facility, 2 individuals sat in cells that had just become pieces on a board they didn't know they were part of. Somewhere Viktor Volkov was waiting for a response that would tell him something about the woman who had deviated from his model and survived. She thought about him, not with fear, not with anger, with the particular respect that one professional extends to another when the other is genuinely dangerous, when the other is smart and patient and has resources and motivation and a track record that demands to be taken seriously. She thought about what he would do next. He would adjust. He would rebuild his model to include the deviation variable. He would design the next trap around someone who moves unpredictably, who thinks at speed, who does not follow doctrine, when doctrine is the thing being used against her. He would try to be ready for everything she could be. And the thing about that, the thing she understood, with a clarity that felt almost like calm, was that being ready for everything she could be required knowing everything she was capable of. And Volkov, for all his intelligence and preparation and operational history, had one significant problem. He still didn't know what she was fully capable of. Neither in some ways did she. That was not a frightening thought. It was an interesting one. She walked back down the corridor toward the planning room where she knew Sullivan was already working, and Torres would arrive within the next 10 minutes, and Blake would appear at some point between now and dinner with something new for them to think about. She walked toward the work, because the work was what came next, and what came next was the thing she was built for. Sullivan was already in the planning room when Megan arrived. He was standing at the table with the paper map spread in front of him, not a digital display, not a tablet, but an actual paper map with handwritten annotations in the margins, the kind of operational tool that people who had been doing this long enough still trusted more than any screen, because paper didn't crash, and paper didn't need a power source, and paper had never in Sullivan's experience been hacked. He didn't look up when she came in. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. "Sit down." She sat. He kept looking at the map for another 30 seconds, not ignoring her, processing something. She had been around Sullivan long enough in the past 48 hours to understand the difference between his silences, the one that meant he was thinking, the one that meant he was waiting, and the one that meant he had arrived at something he wasn't entirely sure how to say. This was the third one. He finally looked up. "The analysts finished their timeline an hour ago," he said. "The intelligence that Volkov received about our operation, the approach vector, the timing, the communication window, it didn't come from outside Iron Wolf." She held very still. "It came from inside," he said. The words landed in the room the way that certain words land, not with noise, but with weight. The kind of weight that changes the shape of everything around it. "How confident?" she asked. 92%. The specific details Volkov had access to were only available to people with direct operational knowledge. The analyst ran the access log backward from the intelligence package and identified a corridor. A narrow one. He paused. 3 people had access to everything Volkov knew. Blake is one of them. I am another. He said it without flinching. Because Sullivan was the kind of man who said difficult things directly, not because it was comfortable, but because comfort was never the point. "The third," she asked. "Someone who left the unit 8 months ago, medical discharge, voluntary separation officially." Sullivan folded his hands on the map. "His name is Marcus Webb. He was with the Iron Wolf for 6 years. Good operator, the kind of person you trust because he has given you every reason to." Megan processed this. "And Volkov's message," she said, "the negotiation offer, is designed to give Webb time to disappear before we connect the corridor to him." Sullivan's jaw tightened slightly. "Volkov isn't trying to negotiate. He's buying his asset and exit window." "How long does Webb have before the analyst corridor becomes an identification?" 18 hours, maybe 20. After that, the evidence trail is complete enough for a formal action. "And Volkov knows that timeline." Sullivan looked at her. "Yes," he said, "he does." She sat with the full weight of it for a moment. The trap inside the trap. Not just the negotiation message as a timing mechanism to observe Iron Wolf's response. The negotiation message as a clock, a countdown, that gave Webb exactly enough time to reach a position from which extraction became impossible if Iron Wolf followed standard protocol. Standard protocol meant a formal investigation. A formal investigation meant process. Process meant time. And time was what Volkov had bought as asset. She said, "He's not buying Webb an exit. He's moving Webb to a new position." Sullivan's eyes sharpened. "Explain." "If Volkov wanted Webb to simply disappear, he would have moved him the moment the Syria operation concluded. The fact that he sent the message now after the operation, after the failure, means he's not protecting Webb from exposure. He's repositioning Webb for the next use." She leaned forward slightly. "Webb isn't done. Whatever Webb has been doing for Volkov, it isn't finished. The negotiation message buys time, not for Webb to escape, but for Webb to complete something." Sullivan stared at her. 15 seconds of silence. "You got that from what I just told you," he said. "I got that from what you just told me, plus what we know about how Volkov operates," she said. "He doesn't protect assets that are burned. He protects assets that are still operational. A burned asset is a liability. He would have cut Webb loose already if Webb's value was exhausted." Sullivan turned back to the map. His hands were flat on the table and he was looking at something in the middle distance that had nothing to do with the paper in front of him. "If you're right," he said slowly, "then Webb is currently in position somewhere, doing something. And we have 18 hours before Volkov's window closes and whatever Webb is doing reaches its conclusion. Yes, Megan said. Sullivan said Blake needs to know this right now. He was already moving toward the door. At 17:22, Blake, Sullivan, Torres, Hayes, and Megan were back in the briefing room. The rest of the team was on standby. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from the careful, measured quality of the afternoon session to something tighter, faster. The specific energy of people who have realized that the clock they thought they had is shorter than they believed. Blake listened to Sullivan present the analysis without interrupting. When Sullivan finished, Blake looked at Megan. This is your read, he said. Yes. Walk me through it. She did, completely. The logic chain from Volkov's message to Webb's current operational status, the distinction between asset protection and asset repositioning, the 18-hour window and what it meant. Blake listened with the stillness of someone who processes information at speed and does not perform the processing for the benefit of observers. When she finished, he said, "What's Webb completing?" "I don't know, but it has to be something that uses what Webb knows about Iron Wolf specifically. That's his value to Volkov. He's not a general intelligence asset. He's a specialized one. He knows this team. He knows how we operate, how we think, how we make decisions under pressure." Torres said, "He knows our next operational target." The room went quiet. "We have a next operational target," Torres continued. "It's been in planning for 3 weeks. Webb left the unit 8 months ago, but he had relationships. People who might have said things they shouldn't." He looked at Blake. "If Webb knows what we're going after next, and Volkov knows what we're going after next," Blake finished the sentence, "then the next mission is already compromised before we've briefed it," Hayes said with a controlled intensity that was the closest he ever got to alarm. "We need to know if the next target is blown." "We need to know where Webb is," Sullivan said. "Right now, tonight." Blake looked at the table for a moment, the look of a man running calculations that involve more variables than most people hold in their heads simultaneously. "All right," he said. "Here's what we're going to do." He laid it out in 8 minutes, clean, no wasted language. The formal investigation into Webb would proceed on its official timeline, not because it was the right pace, but because accelerating it would signal to Volkov's monitoring that Iron Wolf had identified the corridor. That signal would cause Volkov to move Webb immediately before the repositioning was complete, before whatever Webb was doing reached its conclusion. Simultaneously, off the official timeline and outside any channel that Webb might still have visibility into Sullivan, and Megan would work the Webb question directly, not through official resources, through the specific kind of knowledge that 6 years of operating alongside someone produces the understanding of how a person thinks, what they value, where they go when they need to feel safe. "You knew Webb," Blake said to Sullivan. 6 years, Sullivan said. "You know where he'd go." Sullivan said nothing for a moment. "Then I know where he'd go if he was scared. I know where he'd go if he thought he was winning." A pause. "I know the difference between those two things when I look at him." "What does he think right now?" Sullivan's jaw tightened. "He thinks he's winning," he said. "He designed a trap that almost killed us. His assets survived the Syria operation. Volkov's message bought him time. From his perspective, he's a step ahead." A pause. "Which means he's somewhere he considers safe because he's done this before, and it worked, and he hasn't been caught." Blake nodded. "Find him," he said. At 1900, Sullivan and Megan sat in a small room off the main corridor with a laptop, a secure phone, and 6 years of Sullivan's operational memory. Sullivan talked. Megan listened and then built a map, not a physical map, but a psychological one. The landscape of Marcus Webb, as Sullivan described him. Not his surface features, his patterns, the way he made decisions under pressure, the things he valued, the places those values pointed toward. "He's from Oregon," Sullivan said. "Small town eastern side of the Cascades. Dry country. He talked about it sometimes, not sentimental about it. He wasn't a sentimental person, but he referenced it the way that people reference the thing that formed them when they're not trying to." "Does he have family there?" "Mother. She passed 3 years ago. Father was out of the picture early." Sullivan thought. "There's an uncle, Phil, I think. Phil Webb. He ran a ranch outside a town called Prinville. Marcus used to go there between deployments when he had more than a week. He told me once it was the only place where he could sleep without..." Sullivan stopped. "Without what?" Sullivan looked at her. Without checking the exits first, he said quietly. Megan sat with that. The particular tragedy of it. A man who had spent years in service, who had carried the specific weight that service puts on a person, who had found one place in the world where that weight lifted briefly, and who had somewhere in the space between that person and this one made a choice that put everything he had ever been on the wrong side of a line. He'd go there, Sullivan said, not a question. If he thinks he's winning, Megan said, he'd go somewhere that feels like a reward, somewhere that has meaning for him, somewhere he associates with safety and completion. She paused. And he'd go now, while Volkov's window is open and before anyone connects the corridor to him. Sullivan was already reaching for the secure phone. I know someone in Crook County, he said. At 21:15, they had confirmation. A vehicle matching Webb's last known registration had been seen at a fuel station 12 miles outside Prineville at 1740. The attendant remembered it because the driver had paid cash for everything, including 2 large coffees and a road map, which nobody bought anymore. And the specific combination of cash payment and paper map was the kind of thing that stood out to someone who was paying attention. Sullivan relayed this to Blake at 21:18. Blake said, "How do you want to move on this?" Sullivan looked at Megan. She said, "Not directly, not yet." "Explain." "If we move on Webb directly, Volkov's monitoring picks up the movement and he pulls whatever Webb is doing back. We lose the operational picture." She said it carefully, the way she said things when she was moving through a logic chain that had to be correct because the margin for error was 0. "We need to know what Webb is completing before we take him. If we take him without knowing what he was in the middle of, we don't know what Volkov has already received. We don't know if the next target is blown." Sullivan said, "You want to watch him." "I want to watch him finish." A silence. Hayes, who had been listening from the doorway, said, "That's a significant risk. If he completes the transfer before we move, if we move before he completes the transfer, we spend the next 6 months trying to assess the damage to the next operation from an incomplete picture." Megan looked at Hayes directly. "We need the complete picture. Webb gives us that." Hayes looked at Sullivan. Sullivan looked at Blake on the phone. Blake said, "How long do you need?" Megan said, 6 hours. "I need to be in position to observe Webb's next contact, identify the transferer, and give you a complete picture before we move." A pause on Blake's end. 6 hours puts us at 0300. "Yes. And you want to do this personally?" It wasn't a question. He already knew. "Yes," she said. Another pause. Blake said, "Sullivan goes with you." "Agreed. You have 6 hours. At 0300, regardless of what you have or don't have, I am moving on Webb's position with everything I can legally deploy." "Understood." "Understood." At 2200, Megan and Sullivan were moving. Not as Iron Wolf, not with the team, not with the support structure, not with the radio network that made a special operations element what it was. 2 people in a civilian vehicle on a dark highway in Central Oregon, running a clock that had 6 hours on it and a consequence on the other end that affected everyone she had come to know in the last 72 hours. Sullivan drove. He drove the way he did everything, without waste, without performance. The specific efficiency of someone who has been trained to treat every action as a resource to be conserved. They rode in silence for the first 40 minutes. Then Sullivan said, "You've never done this kind of work before." "Surveillance and interdiction, no. It's different from Overwatch." "I know. In Overwatch, you control the environment. You choose your position. You set your parameters. The situation comes to you." He kept his eyes on the road. "This is the opposite. The situation is already set. Webb is in the environment. You're entering his." She understood what he was actually telling her. "He'll be watching for surveillance," she said. "Yes. He's been trained by people who trained alongside me. He knows how we look. He knows how we move. He knows the specific way that surveillance from this community sets itself up." Sullivan paused. "Which means you cannot look like surveillance from this community. Which means I can't look like anyone from Iron Wolf. Which means," Sullivan said carefully, "you're going in alone." She turned to look at him. "You can't be with me," he said. "Webb knows me. If he sees me within 10 miles of Prineville tonight, he's gone in 60 seconds and we lose everything." Sullivan's hands on the wheel were steady. "I'll be on comms. I'll be close enough to move if you need me. But the observation has to be you. The weight of that settled over her. Not panic, not the performance of calm over panic. The real thing, the settling of a significant requirement onto a person who has decided somewhere below the level of conscious thought that the requirement will be met. "What's my cover?" she asked. Sullivan almost smiled. "You're visiting a friend who lives off Route 26. You got turned around. You stopped for directions. At 2 in the morning. People get lost at 2 in the morning." She thought about what she needed to know about Webb, about how he would present himself if he thought he was safe, about the specific way that trained people behave when they believe they are unobserved, not relaxed exactly, because that kind of training never fully turns off. But less managed, more natural. "He'll have a phone," she said. "Burner, multiple. He'll make contact before dawn. If he's completing a transfer, he needs to do it while Volkov's window is open, which closes in," she checked the time, 14 hours. "He'll move within the next 4, Sullivan said. "Then I need to be in position before he moves." "Yes." At 23:40, Sullivan pulled off the highway onto a gravel road and stopped. He handed her an earpiece, a small civilian phone with a single number programmed in, a jacket that had nothing about it to suggest military origin. She put in the earpiece. "If you need to abort," Sullivan said, "I'll abort. If he makes you, I'll abort. Megan." She looked at him. Sullivan, who almost never used first names. Sullivan, who communicated primarily in the compression of tone and the economy of expression. Sullivan, who had looked at her in the briefing room days ago with the careful neutrality of a man reserving judgment. He said, "Be careful." 2 words. From Sullivan, they carried the weight of a full sentence, and she said, "I will." She got out of the vehicle and walked into the dark. The ranch was 11 minutes on foot from where Sullivan had stopped. She knew the layout from a satellite image Sullivan had pulled on his phone before they left the highway, not detailed, not close enough to give her the interior, but enough to know the structure. Main house, 2 outbuildings, a gravel drive coming in from the east. She moved through the dark with the specific quality of attention that her training had built into her total environmental awareness without the paralysis of total environmental awareness. She was processing everything. She was not stopping to process anything. She reached the tree line at the edge of the property at 23:53. The main house had 2 lights on, not bright, the kind of lights that say someone is present but not active, reading maybe or sitting with a phone waiting for something. She found her position, settled, and waited. At 00:17, a light in the main house moved. Not the light itself, someone carrying a light source moving from one room to another. The specific movement of someone who has decided to do something. She keyed her earpiece. Movement inside. Single person. Sullivan copy. Clock. 14 hours on Volkov's window. If Webb is transferring tonight, it's soon. Copy. I'm 3 minutes out on foot. Hold your position. Holding. At 00:41, the front door of the main house opened. A man came out. She had studied Marcus Webb's photograph for 40 minutes in the vehicle. She had built the image into her memory with the same precision she applied to everything, not just the face, but the way the face sat on a body, the specific set of the shoulders, the way a person carries their height. It was Webb. He was carrying a phone, not holding it to his ear, carrying it the way you carry something you are about to use. He moved to a position approximately 30 meters from the house and stopped. Looked around. Not the casual look of someone checking their surroundings. The professional look of someone clearing the space. His gaze passed across her tree line. She did not move. Not a muscle, not a breath. His gaze moved on. She exhaled. He raised the phone. She keyed Sullivan. "He's making contact. I need audio." Sullivan said, "Can't get you audio at this range without equipment I don't have." "I know." She watched Webb. "I need to close." A pause. "Megan." "I know," she said. "I'm doing it." She moved, not fast, the opposite of fast. The specific pace that makes movement invisible, not stillness, not speed, but the intermediate state that draws no attention because it draws no contrast. 20 meters, 15. She stopped behind the near outbuilding. Webb's voice was audible now. Not every word. Fragments. The specific fragments that a person catches when they are close enough to hear tone, but not close enough to hear everything. She listened. "Complete before 0400. The target sequence is," She caught three words that she was not supposed to catch. Three words that stopped her blood cold for exactly 1 second before her training pushed through it and turned the cold into information. The words were Iron Wolf Sniper. Volkov already knew she was the variable. He had not just built her into his next model, he had made her the target of the next operation. Not Iron Wolf as a unit, her specifically, by name, by designation. She keyed Sullivan. She said two words. Move now. Sullivan said copy, moving. She stood up from behind the outbuilding. Webb spun. He was faster than she expected, the speed of someone whose reflexes had been maintained, and for 1 second they simply looked at each other across the dark. The man who had betrayed the team and the woman who had been made his successor's specific target. Webb said Carter. He knew her commands, of course he did. She said, put the phone down, Marcus. He didn't put the phone down. His free hand moved towards something at his hip. She said very clearly, very steadily, don't. Not a threat, not a performance. The specific voice of someone who means exactly what they say and has the capability to back it. Webb's hand stopped. A silence. Then his free hand came up slowly, away from his hip. She walked toward him. The phone, she said. He held it out. She took it. On the screen, a text thread was open. The last sent message was a string of numbers and a three-word phrase. She read it. She read it twice. She keyed Sullivan. I have the phone. Webb is secure. I need Blake on the line in the next 2 minutes. Sullivan, copy. He's already calling. At 0119, Blake came on the line. She read him the message on the phone. The three-word phrase was a target designation for a military installation in northern Jordan. The number string was a date and time, 71 hours from now. There was a silence on Blake's end. Then, he was going to hit a friendly installation. With whatever we were planning to do in that region, she said, Volkov was going to position a force at the target coordinates using our operational timeline and let Iron Wolf walk into it. She paused. We would have been attacking a position held by someone waiting for us. Blake said, how did Volkov get our next target? She looked at Webb. Webb looked back at her. Not defiant, not broken. The expression of a man who has been very good at something for a long time and has come to the end of it. She said, you're going to answer that question. Webb said nothing for a moment. Then, you moved between shots. She stared at him. In Syria, he said, Volkov told me you moved between shots. He said no one moves between shots in that sequence. It's not doctrine. He looked at her steadily. He said you were different. You fed him everything he needed to come after me specifically. I told him what I knew about Iron Wolf, Webb said. He decided the sniper was the variable on his own. You knew what he was going to do with the information. A pause. Yes, Webb said. One word, no excuse behind it, just the bare, terrible honesty of a man who has run out of room. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Hayes in the hallway telling her the team had a rhythm. She thought about Torres and his sister. She thought about Sullivan saying, your father would be proud at the extraction point. She thought about Blake saying, Iron Wolf Sniper, in a way that meant you belong here. She thought about all of it. And then she thought about Marcus Webb, who had once belonged here too, who had once been the person Sullivan trusted, the person Iron Wolf counted on, the person who knew the exits but still went somewhere he could sleep. She didn't feel anger. She felt something more complicated, something that had no clean name and didn't need one. She said, you're going to tell us everything, every contact, every transfer, every piece of information you gave him, and everything he told you in return. Webb looked at her for a long moment. And if I do, he said, you'll have done one right thing, she said, at the end. Another long silence. Webb looked at the phone in her hand. Then he looked at the dark around them. Sullivan appeared from the tree line at that moment, emerging without drama, moving directly to Webb's position with the efficient certainty of someone who has done this many times and knows exactly what comes next. He looked at Webb. Webb looked at Sullivan. Something passed between them that was not language, the specific communication of two people who knew each other through years of proximity and trust and shared difficulty, and who were now standing on opposite sides of a line that neither of them had ever expected to exist between them. Sullivan said Marcus. Webb said Daniel. Sullivan said nothing else. He didn't need to. He put a hand on Webb's arm, not rough, not gentle. The hand of someone who is doing what needs to be done and is not performing how he feels about it. They began to walk. Megan followed. Behind them, the lights in the ranch house were still on. In the east, somewhere beyond the high desert and the Cascades and the sleeping towns between here and the ocean, the sky was beginning its long, barely perceptible shift from one kind of dark to another. She walked through it, carrying the phone, carrying the information on the phone, carrying the weight of a mission that had started as a rescue operation and had become, in the way that real things always become, more complex than their origins, something much larger. She thought about Volkov. Who was still out there? Who had just lost his asset and his window and his 71-hour clock? Who now knew with absolute certainty that the variable had found him before he had found the variable? She thought about what that meant, about what he would do next, about the kind of intelligence and patience and operational sophistication that builds a trap inside a trap inside a trap. And she thought, walking through the pre-dawn dark of Central Oregon with Sullivan's footsteps ahead of her and Webb between them, he is still out there. He is still thinking. He is still building the next model. And the next model has her name in it. That was not a frightening thought. It was a clarifying one, because if Volkov's next model was built around her, then his next model was built around a variable that he still did not fully understand, that he could not fully understand, because the variable was not only what she had done, the variable was what she was capable of becoming. And she was not done becoming it, not even close. Webb talked for 4 hours and 19 minutes. He sat across from Blake, and a counterintelligence officer whose name Megan was never given, in a room she was not in, and he laid out everything. Every contact, every date, every piece of information he had passed to Volkov's network over the course of 11 months. The full architecture of a betrayal that had been constructed carefully, incrementally, in the specific way that people who have been trained to be patient construct things one small piece at a time. Each piece plausible on its own, the complete picture only visible from a distance. Megan knew this because Sullivan told her afterward. She had been in the corridor outside that room for most of those 4 hours, not pacing, not performing anxiety, sitting in a chair against the wall with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, running through everything she knew and building the picture from the outside while Webb built it from the inside. Sullivan came out at 0543 and sat down in the chair beside her. He said nothing for almost a full minute. Then, "He's been operational for Volkov since 14 months before he left the unit." She did the math immediately. "That means he was still active when we planned the Jordan operation," she said. "Yes." "Which means Volkov has had the Jordan target for at least 2 months." "Yes." "And the Syria operation," Sullivan said. "He fed Volkov the Syria parameters 3 weeks before we deployed." She sat with that. 3 weeks, the compound, the approach vector, the communication window, the guard positions as they existed in the original intelligence picture before Volkov reconfigured them into a trap. Webb had given Volkov everything he needed, not just to defend the compound, but to transform it into an ambush designed around the specific operational signature of Iron Wolf. "The 4 covered positions," she said. "Webb described our standard Overwatch doctrine in detail. He told Volkov that the sniper would hold primary position through the engagement sequence." Sullivan's voice was the flattest she had ever heard it. "Volkov built the detection vehicle around that assumption." She exhaled slowly. "If I hadn't moved, you would have been located after the first shot, and the team would have lost Overwatch cover at the worst possible moment." Sullivan looked at her. "The assault element would have been exposed without cover during the breach. In that configuration with the covered positions Volkov had prepared." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She understood the arithmetic of what would have happened. She had understood it in fragments since Syria. Now she understood it completely. The full weight of the deviation, the 80 seconds of instinct-driven calculation that had made her move when doctrine said stay, landed on her all at once. She sat very still under the weight of it. "You couldn't have known," Sullivan said. "I didn't know," she said. "I felt the geometry was wrong." "I know." "If I had known it would have been doctrine," she said. "It only worked because it was the thing nobody planned for." Sullivan looked at her steadily. "That is exactly correct," he said. At 0630, Blake came out of the room. He looked at both of them and then sat down in the corridor with the specific posture of a man who has been processing difficult information for several hours. and whose body has begun to remind him that it has physical limits regardless of what his mind requires. He said, Jordan is scrubbed. We're pulling the operation and rebuilding from scratch with a different target profile and a new timeline. Anyone Volkov placed in that region based on Webb's intelligence is going to find an empty coordinate. Sullivan said, and Volkov on. Blake said, he's aware his window closed. He knows Webb is in custody. He'll burn his current network and rebuild. A pause, which gives us a specific window to act before the rebuild is complete. Megan said, how wide is the window? Blake looked at her. Narrow, he said. 72 hours, maybe less. Volkov moves fast when he's restructuring. He's done it before. Then we need to move in 72 hours. We need to move on a target we can develop from clean intelligence in 72 hours. Hours, Blake said, which is not straightforward. But it's possible, she said. Blake studied her. What are you thinking, he asked. I'm thinking that Volkov is going to do the same thing he always does when his plan fails, she said. He's going to recalibrate. He's going to rebuild his model. He's going to take everything he learned from Syria and everything he learned tonight and build the next version. She paused. And the next version is going to be built around me. You said that before, Blake said. I'm saying it again because it matters differently now. She leaned forward slightly. He doesn't just know I'm a variable. He knows specifically how I deviate. He knows I move between shots. He knows I identified the detection vehicle in 90 seconds. He knows I recognize the trap inside the negotiation message. She looked at Blake directly. He's building a model of me, and the model he's building is more complete than it was 48 hours ago. Blake said, You're saying we need to move before the model is complete. I'm saying we need to move while he still has gaps in head, while there are things about how I operate that he has not yet seen. She paused. Because once the model is complete, the advantage disappears. The corridor was quiet. Sullivan said, She's right. Blake looked at Sullivan. Sullivan said, Volkov's pattern across 4 previous operations is consistent. He builds his model, he designs the trap around the model, and then he executes. He has never failed when the model was complete. He has only failed when the variable exceeded the model. He looked at Megan. The variable needs to exceed the model one more time before he finishes building it. Blake said, What do you need? At 0715, the full team assembled. Not the careful, structured assembly of a formal briefing. Something faster. Something that still had the specific texture of the last 72 hours on it, the fatigue and the adrenaline, and the accumulated weight of what they had been through together, pressing into the room and making the air feel dense. Hayes looked at Megan when she walked in. She looked back at him. He said, Webb. Webb, she confirmed. He exhaled through his nose. 6 years. I know. Sullivan trusted him. I know. Hayes looked at the table for a moment, not processing the betrayal. He had already processed that in the corridor outside in the specific, rapid way that operators process things they cannot afford to spend too much time on. He was processing something else. The Syria operation, he said, the covered positions, the detection vehicle. He looked at her. Webb told Volkov the sniper would hold position. Yes, and you didn't. No. Hayes said, You didn't know about Webb. You didn't know about the detection vehicle being targeted at you specifically. You just felt the geometry was wrong. Yes. He looked at her for a long time. You saved us without knowing you were saving us, he said. She didn't answer that because the answer was complicated. She had saved them by being who she was, by having been trained the way she had been trained, by carrying her father's voice into a situation where everything her father had ever taught her became in 4 seconds the only thing that mattered. You couldn't take credit for being who you were. You could only be grateful that who you were turned out to be the right thing at the right moment. Blake started the briefing at 0730. He had spent 45 minutes with the intelligence analysts and had returned with a target, not the Jordan operation, not anything that Webb's intelligence could have contaminated. Something pulled from a separate source, a separate network, a separate chain of information that had no intersection with anything Webb had touched. Volkov had a logistics node, a point in the network where resources, personnel, and operational intelligence converged before distribution to field assets. It existed in a location that Blake described with the careful language of operational security, a location that Megan understood was real and dangerous and accessible within the timeline they had. It was not a compound this time. It was a meeting. A specific meeting between Volkov and three of his senior operational coordinators scheduled according to intelligence that had been developed entirely outside any channel Webb had accessed for 31 hours from now. If we hit this meeting, Blake said, we don't just disrupt the current operation. We collapse the network's command structure at the moment it is most vulnerable during the rebuild phase when Volkov is actively reconfiguring and the nodes don't yet have full connectivity to each other. Torres said, and Blake said, Volkov will be present. The room took that in. Sullivan said, this is a capture or kill operation. Yes, Blake said. On a former Spetsnaz officer with 43 years of operational experience, who has now specifically identified our sniper as his primary counterintelligence concern. Yes, Blake said, which means he'll have the meeting in a location that accounts for sniper threat. Yes, Blake said, which means standard Overwatch doesn't work. Blake looked at Megan, which is why the sniper needs to tell me how it does work, he said. Every person in the room looked at her, not with doubt, not with the careful assessment of people managing their uncertainty about someone they hadn't yet decided to trust, with the specific quality of attention that people give to the person they believe has the answer. She felt it land differently than anything had landed before, not because she needed it, not because the mission required their belief to function, but because the distance between the silence in that first briefing room and the silence in this one was so vast, and she had lived every step of it, and the arrival felt like something real. She said, he's going to choose a location with overhead coverage, a structure with a roof or multiple roofs or terrain masking that eliminates conventional Overwatch angles. She looked at the table. He's going to think about the shot I can't take. He's going to design his position around the geometry I can't access. So how do you access it? Hayes asked. She said, I don't. I change what the shot is. Torres said, explain. He's expecting a long-range engagement. He's expecting me to be at distance, looking down from elevation, working in the conventional sniper paradigm. She looked at Blake. I go the other direction. Close. Inside the geometry he builds to protect himself. Inside the range where his overhead coverage and terrain masking don't function because the threat is already within the perimeter he constructed. A silence. Hayes said very quietly, you're talking about going in with us. I'm talking about being inside the objective, she said. Not Overwatch, not 1,000 meters back, inside. Sullivan said, that's not a sniper role. No, she said, it's not. Another silence. It's the role Volkov doesn't have in his model, she said. He knows the sniper. He's planned for the sniper. He has not planned for the sniper who puts down the sniper role and becomes something else entirely. Blake looked at her for a long moment. He said, can you function in a close quarters environment? Yes. Your qualification is, ask Sullivan, she said. Everyone looked at Sullivan. Sullivan said her CQB scores from advanced training put her in the top 6% of operators I have worked with in 22 years. He said it flatly, no emphasis. The tone of someone stating a fact they consider unremarkable. The room absorbed this. Hayes made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. The sound of someone who has been surprised past the point where surprise has a clean expression. Blake said, all right, here's how we're going to do this. He built the plan in real time, integrating what Megan had said, cross-referencing it against what the intelligence picture gave them, adjusting for the specific requirements of a 31-hour timeline. The team contributed Torres on the approach, Hayes on the breach sequence, Sullivan on the communication architecture. Each person adding to a structure that was becoming, as they built it, something more complete than any single person could have designed alone. At one point, Hayes turned to Megan and said, entry order, where do you want to be? She said second. He looked at her. You want to be second through the door. Second gives me the assessment position. First clears the threshold, second reads the room and makes the primary contact decision. She paused. I read rooms. Hayes stared at her for a second, then he turned back to the planning map and wrote her name in the second position without further discussion. It was a small thing. It was the thing that everything had been building toward. The briefing closed at 9:47. Megan walked out of the room and found herself in the corridor alone for the first time since Sullivan had found Webb at the ranch, and she stood there for a moment and let everything catch up to her. The last 72 hours assembled themselves in her mind not as a sequence of events, but as a single continuous thing. One long, unbroken thread that had begun in that first briefing room when the conversation stopped and the doubt settled over her like weather and had run without interruption through Syria and the extraction and the debrief and Volkov's message and Webb in the dark and the 4 hours of confession in the corridor in this moment right now. She thought about her father. She thought about him very specifically, not as a symbol, not as a voice in her head, but as a person. A man who had come back from 2 tours carrying things he never fully put down, who had channeled the best parts of what he had learned into a daughter who was standing in a corridor in a classified facility after 72 hours that would never appear in any official record, holding herself together, because holding herself together was what the situation required. She thought, I wish you could see this. Not the mission, not the shots or the intel or the plan assembling itself in that room. The room itself, the way they said her name now, the way Hayes wrote her in the second position without hesitation, the way Torres had said, you're someone who thinks differently and meant it as the highest thing he knew how to say. The way Sullivan, who almost never used first names, had said, Megan, be careful in the dark on the gravel road, and put everything into 2 words that would have taken someone else a paragraph. Her father would have understood all of it. He would have understood it without explanation, the way that people who have lived inside that specific world understand things that exist outside the reach of ordinary language. She let herself have the thought completely. Then she let it go, and she walked back toward the planning room because there was work to do. 31 hours later, Iron Wolf moved. The approach was different from Syria. Everything about this operation was different from Syria: the timeline, the target, the role distribution, the specific geometry of the threat. Where Syria had been about distance and elevation and the solitary discipline of Overwatch, this was about proximity and speed and the compressed total environment awareness of close quarters work. Megan moved through the approach with the team, not separated, not climbing to a ridgeline while they moved toward the breach. Among them, in the formation, in the rhythm that she had studied for 6 weeks before Syria and understood from the inside now. Hayes was in front of her. Torres was behind her. She was second. The building was a 3-story structure in an industrial district, the kind of location that is chosen for meetings precisely because it has nothing specific about it, nothing that stands out, nothing that a surveillance analyst would flag as a significant site. Volkov had planned carefully. The structure had a roof line that blocked conventional elevated observation from every approach vector. The interior layout, according to Webb's knowledge of Volkov's operational preferences, would put the meeting room in the building's interior. No exterior walls, no windows, no conventional sniper access. Everything Volkov had built assumed that the sniper was outside. At 02:12, Hayes hit the door. It opened in one movement. He crossed the threshold. Megan was through 2 steps behind him. The room read itself to her in the first second, 4 people at a table, one standing near the far wall, the specific spatial arrangement of a meeting that has been running long enough that some participants have shifted from their original positions. Volkov was at the table. She recognized him from the intelligence photograph, but more than that, she recognized him from the accumulation of everything she had come to know about him. The way he sat, the particular stillness of someone who has not been surprised in a very long time. He was surprised now. She saw it, a fraction of a second, a micro-expression that traveled across his face with the speed of something the body produces before the mind can manage it. The recognition of something his model had not predicted. Not Iron Wolf in the room, the sniper in the room. He said something, not in English. The specific sound of a word in Russian that doesn't require translation because the tone carries everything. She said, Viktor Volkov, do not move. He looked at her. His eyes were the specific eyes of someone who is running calculations faster than most people think, evaluating geometry and timing and the positions of the people in the room and the probability distributions of every possible action available to him. He was the best at what he did. She knew that. She had known that since Syria. He ran his calculations. She let him run them. And she watched the moment, the precise, specific moment when he reached the end of his calculations and arrived at the only conclusion that the geometry supported. He said in English that was almost unaccented, "You came inside." "Yes," she said. "That is not in the model," he said. "No, Shuab," she said. "It's not." A silence. Behind her, Iron Wolf was moving through the room with the efficiency of a team that has been through enough together to function as a single organism. The three coordinators were being separated. The perimeter was being secured. The standard machinery of a successful interdiction was expressing itself with the competence that 22 years of Sullivan and 4 years of Hayes and every other accumulation of experience in that team produced. Volkov did not look at any of it. He looked at her. He said, "In Syria, the detection vehicle." "Yes." "You moved between shots." "Yes, well, that is not doctrine." "No." He looked at her for a long moment. "I built the next model around the deviation," he said. "I know," she said. "I accounted for movement. I accounted for non-standard engagement sequences. I accounted for unconventional position selection." His voice was the voice of a man who is being genuinely honest, not performing, not managing, just honest. "I did not account for the sniper who abandons the sniper role entirely." She said, "You can't account for everything." He said, "No." A pause. "But I can account for most things." "Most things isn't everything," she said. He looked at her. And then Viktor Volkov, the man who had built traps that destroyed Western Special Operations elements, who had run intelligence operations on 3 continents, who had studied Iron Wolf with the precision of a craftsman studying the thing he intends to dismantle, nodded once, slowly, the nod of one professional acknowledging another. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then Sullivan appeared at her left shoulder, and the moment closed the way moments close when the operational requirement supersedes everything else, and Volkov was separated from the table, and the process took over, and the room became what it needed to become. At 0347, the building was secure, and the intelligence harvest had begun. At 0520, Iron Wolf extracted. In the vehicle, nobody said anything for the first 10 minutes. Then Torres said, "Second through the door." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Hayes said from the front seat without turning around, "I've been second through the door 11 times in 4 years. A pause. "I've never seen anyone read a room that fast." Megan said nothing because the thing she felt in that moment was not something that words improved. Sullivan beside her said, "Your father." She looked at him. "The thing he told you," Sullivan said, "a rifle is not about pulling a trigger. It's about controlling yourself when the world is falling apart." "Yes," she said. "It's not just about the rifle," Sullivan said. She looked at him. "It never was," he said. At 0800, Blake called the team together for the after-action review. He stood at the front of the room and he looked at each person around the table and he said, "The network is in custody. Volkov is in custody. The Jordan operation is being rebuilt on clean intelligence and will proceed when the timeline supports it." He paused. "What happened in the last 72 hours will not appear in any document that most people will ever read. It will not be publicly acknowledged. It will not be celebrated in any conventional sense." Another pause. "But I want to say in this room to this team what it was." He looked around the table. "It was Iron Wolf operating at the level this team was built to operate at," he said. "And it happened because every person in this room was exactly who they needed to be." His gaze moved to Megan. He held it there. He said, "Especially the ones we almost didn't trust." The room was very quiet, not the silence of the first briefing, not the silence of doubt or assessment or people waiting to be convinced. The silence of people who have been through something together and know in the wordless way that shared difficulty produces knowledge exactly where they stand. Hayes looked at Megan across the table. He said, "For the record." She looked at him. "I was wrong from the first second," he said, "and I want that on the record." Torres said, "Noted." Sullivan said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way that it very rarely moved, just slightly. The specific expression of a man who finds something correct. Megan looked at Blake. Blake said, "Anything from you?" She thought about what she wanted to say, about everything she could say, about Syria in the 4 seconds, in the 80 seconds, in Webb in the dark, in Volkov's nod, in Hayes writing her name in the second position, and Sullivan saying your father would be proud, and Torres's sister who saved 47 kids last year. She thought about all of it, and she said, I was built for this. 3 words, not arrogance, not performance. The clean, simple truth of someone who has arrived at the place where everything they have ever been was always pointing and has found against every expectation and through every doubt that the place is real, that it holds, that it was worth every single step. The room absorbed it. Blake nodded. The meeting closed. 2 weeks later, Megan stood in front of the same operators who had looked at her with doubt in that first briefing room. The room was the same. The table was the same. The light through the narrow windows was the same flat, indeterminate quality that it always was at this hour. But nothing else was the same. Blake stood beside her. He said, effective immediately, Lieutenant Carter is appointed lead instructor for advanced sniper integration within the special operations community. Her mandate is to develop the next generation of Overwatch operators with the kind of cross-disciplinary capability that this team has seen demonstrated in the last month. He paused. Not because she is the best shot, because she understands something that most people in this community spend their whole careers missing. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He said, tell them. She looked at the room, at Hayes and Torres and Sullivan and Ramirez and Chen, and every face that had once looked at her with doubt and now looked at her with the specific, hard-earned attention of people who have been changed by someone. She said, a great soldier does not only win battles. A great soldier gives other people the ability to survive them. The room was quiet. Hayes looked at the table, then looked up. Sullivan looked at nothing in particular in the way that Sullivan looked at nothing when he was actually looking at everything. Torres had his arms folded, and his expression was the closed, serious expression that he wore when something was reaching him in a place he didn't usually allow things to reach. Megan looked at all of them, and she thought this is what it is. Not the rank, not this designation, not the official appointment or the after-action record or the citation that would never be publicly released. This, a room full of people who had doubted her and been wrong and had the character to say so and the professionalism to change. A room full of people who had bled together and kept going and built something out of all the difficult, irreducible material of their shared experience. A room she belonged to, not because she had demanded entry, not because she had argued for her right to be there, but because she had shown up in the dark and done the work and been exactly who she was and trusted that who she was would be enough. It had been enough. It had been more than enough. Outside somewhere in the world, Volkov was in a secure facility, building a new model, a final revised model that included everything he had learned, everything she had shown him. He would work at it with the patience and intelligence that made him what he was. He would build something extraordinary, and it still wouldn't be enough, because the thing he could never fully build into any model was the reason underneath the calculation. The thing her father had given her. The thing that lived not in the technique or the doctrine or the calculation, but in the place where all of those things came from. The reason she was there. The reason she had always been there. Some people spend their whole lives trying to prove they belong somewhere. Megan Carter had simply gone into the dark and done the work and let the belonging find her. And when it did, when Iron Wolf said her name, the way Iron Wolf